Welcome to the Pursuit of Learning podcast. I'm your host, Clint Murphy. My goal is for each of us to grow personally, professionally, and financially, one conversation at a time. To do that, we will have conversations with subject matter experts across a variety of modalities. My job as your host will be to dig out those golden nuggets of wisdom that will facilitate our growth. Join me on this pursuit. Compassionate leaders are not weak leaders. I'm going to say that one more time. Compassionate leaders are not weak. In fact, they're tough leaders who understand they can both be good to their people and deliver strong results. Today, I had the opportunity to sit down with Donato Tramuto, who wrote the book, The Double Bottom Line, about how compassionate leaders can captivate hearts and deliver results. If you want to be in a workplace that has trust, success, and innovation, strong teams, and better overall performance, this is the conversation for you. Good morning, Donato. Welcome to the Pursuit of Learning podcast. Where I'd love to start with you today is to just understand what's motivating you in life right now.
Wow, that's a great question. I think what's motivating my life right now is the recognition that the enormous discourse that we have in our society, that the many issues that we are all trying to resolve, whether it be food insecurity or loneliness, fiscal inequities, that they seem to find their origin in how high your compassionate leadership IQ is. And to that end, I have been devoting my life and time to helping people understand that you can learn compassion. You can learn it at any age. And that in many respects, when you have compassion, you begin to recognize what is similar between us versus what is different between us. We all have pain. We all suffer from different challenges in life. And there are so many commonalities that if we can all just recognize and understand that we really need to listen to understand than to listen to react. And so that's really been my mission and my commitment for the last, I'm going to say 36 months. We're going to be talking about your book, Double Bottom Line, How Compassionate Leaders Captivate Hearts and Deliver Results. And we'll dive right in. And I'd love to share a quote and then have you respond to why we need this now more than ever. I felt it was a beautiful one to get the conversation started. Now more than ever, leaders need to upgrade skills such as communication, transparency, adaptability, and understanding and support of employees' needs. They need to embrace diversity and inclusion, create stronger teams, and take responsibility for the impact they have on the communities in which they work and on the world. And most importantly, as we are seeing how these shifts affect our neighbors, families, employees, and coworkers, we need to raise empathy and compassion to the top of the list. Wow. That is from our book, and let me comment on that. The best way I can comment on that is that I'm sure you have heard these, what I call, terms du jour. We've heard about the Great Resignation. We've heard about the quiet quitting. All these terms have been, evolving, ever since the pandemic. And quite frankly, I don't think the Great Resignation is the right term. I don't think quiet quitting is the right term. I think it's quiet assessment and the great reflection. Young people, older people are reflecting on their lives in a way that we haven't seen in our generation. It's very funny. This morning, I forget where I read this because I read the Times and the Journal, but there was an article about how CEOs are going crazy over this term quiet quitting. And they're saying these young kids are lazy. They just don't want to work. That is not the case at all. And if anyone approaches it with that type of a reaction, you're not being compassionate, because compassion is all about listening to understand. If you really take the time to understand, why do young workers feel like this? They just come out of a pandemic. Many of them have missed their graduation
or they have missed a birthday party. And so the whole mentality in today's workforce is I want to have passion in my job and I want to also have a life. And it's incumbent upon us as leaders to recognize the trend that's going on. And that's why there are some significant attributes to compassionate leadership. One is you need to be vulnerable yourself. You need to share your story, because I can tell you as a CEO of a public company, as a CEO of a private company, for many years I kept away from the audience and my employees that I was a gay man. I didn't feel comfortable sharing that with anyone. And so I kept it to myself. And what does that do? It creates tension. It creates a disjointed relationship. And so we as leaders have to communicate our own pain. I'm not saying that you have to go around with a banner and announce your pain. In the book, I don't know if you recall, we talk about the Google experiment. And I think that this was a very telling example of what I'm trying to explain here. One of the managers had been rated as not communicative to his employees. And so he decided to call a staff meeting. And he said, let's ask the following question. Let's share something about ourselves that the other person might not know. It's called the Aristotle experiment.
Yeah, Project Aristotle, was that the one you're referring to? Okay. And that was on compassion and collaboration.
Exactly. And he said, I will go first. And he started to share with his employees that he had stage 4 cancer. Everyone dropped literally their jaws. No one knew this. And once he shared that story, somebody else opened up about their having cancer. That is the new work environment, is to be communicative, to listen to understand. Don't listen to react. People are reacting to the term quiet quitting, and they're making assumptions that are just not correct. And so going forward, I think for the workforce to thrive and survive, we have to take the time to understand that the Gen Zers and the millennials are not lazy. They are entering the workforce with a whole new perspective of what they want out of their lives. And the average CEO now is 59 years old. And so you can only begin to see the enormous divide that we as older leaders will have to take a very, very aggressive step forward in embracing this whole new environment. And that's really what the book is about, is to really, help people understand how they can do it.
And so the title, Double Bottom Line, can you share with our listeners, what do you mean by the double bottom line? What are we looking at there?
Well, simply stated is you can have both. Listen, I ran a public company, so I know the responsibilities to shareholders, the responsibility to deliver a profit. And so what the double bottom line basically is saying is you can do good. You can put people first and be profitable. And guess what? I think you're going to be more profitable. And that's why we chose the line, is that the double bottom line really is about captivating hearts and delivering results. It's not one or the other, because I've been asked over the last few months, gosh, can you really have both? Well, I'm a product of that. And listen, I wasn't always a compassionate leader. I don't think I always put people first, and I'm still learning how to do it. And that's my recognition of my own failures, the recognition of my own vulnerabilities. However, the recognition is that I don't think we have any other alternatives today. We're seeing people leaving the workforce, not just young people. We're seeing older people leave the workforce in a manner that I have not seen in my 40 years. And so, yes, focus on profits, and you can also put people at the top of your priority list.
And so there's two stats you share early in the book that are a little bit contradictory. I'd love to get your take on why we're in this type of situation. So the first one is 84% of respondents believe a compassionate workplace encourages cooperation, which leads to greater productivity and profitability. The second one is 68% of people believe that we're in workplaces that are more competitive than cooperative. So if we know that the cooperation, the compassion lead to productivity and profitability, why are almost 70% of us saying we're in the exact opposite type of setting?
Yeah, and by the way, that was the same, I should kind of clarify, we normally did not anticipate that we would go out and interview 1,500 workers. That was a new variable to doing the book. I always knew that I would interview leaders and we interviewed 41 of them. So the data points that you just gave was from the 1,500 people that we surveyed. But now let's go back to the 41 people we interviewed. Nearly 80% of all those individuals felt that they wanted to be more compassionate but didn't know how. And so the contradiction from the 1,500 people, 84% who say that the workforce, in order to be compassionate, has to be collaborative, yet the other data point, 68% of them felt it's more competitive, is something that we found even in the individual interviews, that for whatever reason, we are hardwired as leaders to make the workforce very competitive. And it's funny, I had a call a few weeks ago from one of my executives who now is running a restaurant, and he said, I always remember what you said to me. Don't worry about being competitive inside the workforce. You have to be competitive outside. But we have developed this tendency that you can get more out of your employees if you make your employees competitive with one another. And so that's a really significant nugget from the book. We extracted that out, and I think that will help leaders to really push for more collaboration and to really push for people working together and for people building teams. And by the way, with this whole new workforce that now is a hybrid workforce, we're going to have to work even harder to develop a culture around those very important aspects that you just identified.
And so if we look at it and we start to say, well, what does compassionate leadership look like versus this traditional old school dictatorial win at all costs style of leadership? Can you share with our listeners, and we can dive into as much detail now or as we go through the conversation as you want, what are some of the areas that make up compassionate leadership? And when I read the book, Donato, some of the things that jumped out at me were, a little bit of a list to jog the memory for the listeners. Top down is out, leading from the center, people-centric, team-centric, community-centric. What does that look like?
Yeah, but I think you have to first get back to, what is the definition of compassionate leadership?
Yes, perfect.
I think if we don't get that out in front, then I think we're not going to really connect all the other aspects of it. So one of the things that we really, and by the way, I didn't go into writing this book thinking that I knew what the definition was. I did not. So for those who are listening here, compassionate leadership is not just empathy. And it's very, very funny. Many of the people that we interviewed, that was their first definition in terms of how they explain compassionate leadership, showing empathy. It's not showing empathy. It's empathy in action. It's the willingness to understand, which is one of the variables of how to practice compassionate leadership, is listen to understand. And what I mean by that is listen to the story of the other person. Whenever I have a dinner party, I always ask a question at the dinner party, whether it's 6 guests or 20 guests. I always ask a question so that we can listen to understand the individual who you may not know or who you do know, but you didn't know that story. So the first aspect is take the time to listen to the stories of the employees and then do something about it. Now, I'm best in terms of how I explain things to give you an example. When I became CEO of Healthways in 2015, I had been chairman, and we were under an enormous investigation by activists around, one division that wasn't making money and the other division was making a lot of money. Well, when I became CEO, I could have just made a quick decision. I had been chairman for a year and a half. I followed the activist suit. I was involved in it. But no, you know what I did? We had 2,700 employees. I spent 6 months meeting with about 90% of those employees. It took me 6 months. Wall Street was pressuring me to make a decision. They wanted me to shut down the division that was losing money. And I said, no, I'm going to listen to understand what really is our competitive advantage and what decision points, what I need to take to really build, if you will, a good decision. Guess what I did? 8 months into my tenure, I did something that I don't believe has ever been done. I paid another company to take the division. We had put $1 billion into that division. Imagine going to the board and saying, I have an idea. And that idea wasn't mine. I extracted it out of all the interviews because what people were saying to me is, if you shut it down, the same customer that's buying that product, who's buying the other product in the division that's making money, is going to leave your company. And it's not that we're not competitive, is we're not focused. I gave the company away to a business colleague of mine who I'd known for years. We wrote a $25 million check. This is all public information. We wrote a $25 million check to cover the forthcoming year losses. Fast forward, the stock went from $10, $11 to $23. It hit a high of $48. The market praised me. The employees were happy because I asked the company that was taking it over to keep the employees for a year. I said, you have to really understand how those employees can bring value. And he did that. So my point is, there's a great example of practicing all the variables of compassionate leadership. I listened to understand. I didn't react because Wall Street was saying, make a decision. You need to do something. We collaborated with all the employees. We communicated constantly. On the first day of my appointment as CEO, I said to the employees, I do not expect you to trust me today. But what I do expect is if I'm being honest and transparent and I'm listening to you and I'm being authentic and I'm making decisions that are benefiting all stakeholders, then I expect you to trust me. And that happened. And many of the employees who are not made bonus in 7 years, not only did they make bonus the following year, we paid 200% of their bonus. And so we delivered results, we captivated hearts, and we practiced almost every aspect of what makes a compassionate leadership model effective.
And so there was so much to tackle in there. I love it. Thank you. One of the things you really emphasized was listening to understand. And I noticed when I read the book that we both really appreciated Stephen Covey's seek first to understand, then be understood. And when you wrote about that, you talked about the fact that for our people, feeling seen and heard, listened to, and understood is a deep and fundamental human need. Recognizing that there's quite a distinct difference between being heard, being listened to, and being understood. And being understood, I think, is where we want to get to, Donato. Can you share with our listeners, what are some of the best practices we should be thinking about when it comes to listening to the people on our team, when it comes to listening to our colleagues, and even our family and friends and people in life? What are some of the things we should be thinking about? And how do we work our way through that heard, listening, understood pyramid?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that this is a very sensitive topic for me. At age 8, I lost most of my hearing. And for nearly 10 years, I went through 5 or 6 different surgeries. I was bullied, made fun of. I couldn't hear what people were saying. I spoke funny. I went through an enormous difficult time in my life. And so I think it was really during those years that I understood the value of not just listening, but observing. I forget who said this. I think it was Yogi Berra who once said, you can observe a lot by just watching. And so much about what our listening to understand is about taking the time to observe, taking the time to listen to people's stories, even though you think you may not know their story. How many times I will share this hearing loss with people, and I've only become comfortable in the last 15 years in sharing it, that they're shocked because they hear me speak from the stage or they hear me speak like we are doing today, and they're thinking what a good speaker he is. But do you know I still have a speech impediment, that I have to stay away from certain words, that I have to be careful when I am giving a speech, that I practice, many times before I deliver the speech? And when you tell people this, they're like, you got to be kidding me, because what we see with our eyes, what we hear with our ears is somebody who is fluent. Yes, I'm fluent because I practice it really in a manner that has helped me tremendously. So my point is, listening to understand is taking the time to practice the 3 T's. This is something that I introduced many years ago. The 3 T's is to use tenderness first, to get the trust, which is the second T, and then you can be tenacious. Too many people in leadership positions start off with tenacity, and then they go around with a pooper scooper. They're picking up the mess, but they don't get the trust from their respective, employees. Listening to understand is taking the time to really be tender. It takes time, just like the example I gave you with respect to the company that I had to make a decision on. It took me 6 to 7 months to practice that kind of leadership. However, I can almost guarantee you, when you take the time to really embrace the other person's story and their life, and you get their trust, the decisions you make will be embraced by them. Even if it may not be the right decision, they will know that your heart is in the right place.
So let's dive into that tenderness, because it really ties into me this concept of compassion. And one of the things that jumped out is a lot of leaders, a lot of people think that compassion is weak. And I felt the quote you had from Jeff Weiner, the former CEO of LinkedIn, really underscored the power of compassion and how it's the opposite of weak. When he said, "The strongest people I know are compassionate. True unconditional compassion requires almost superhuman strength and self-confidence." So why do so many people think that compassion and tenderness is weak when it takes so much to do?
Well, it's so funny because as you were speaking, one of the things that really hit me is that, I was accused in my earlier years of having leadership because for whatever reason, people think that compassionate leadership is just about being nice. And they forget that there are two other ingredients to it. And the two other ingredients is the trust and the toughness. And so it's funny, about a year ago, I was walking down the street in my home, town where I vacation in the summertime. And somebody yelled out, "Donato!" And I really didn't know who it was. And they could see that I was looking a little bit puzzled. And they said, "Oh, don't you remember me? You fired me when we were at United Health." And I said, "Oh my gosh, this is not going to go down the right path." And then she could see that I was a little bit embarrassed. And she said, No. You did it in such a compassionate way that it helped me to define my new career. And I've been happy ever since. And so it was so wonderful to see that I could make a tough decision. And I did it in a way that had a sense of respect. It had a sense of inclusion to help the person see that this was the right decision for them. And I gained their trust. And so this is why it's not weak, because if compassion is just about being nice and never being able to make the tough decisions, I would give in to that person who says it's weak. But it's not about just being nice. It's about going down the food chain of being nice, being tender, getting the trust, and then making the tough decisions.
So, Donato, one of the things that a lot of our listeners may deal with is when we're at work, we always feel busy. We have meetings, we have deliverables. How do we find the time to lead with our heart?
Well, let me say this. You actually create more what I call wasteful energy when you don't practice it. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, I was in a conversation with my executives. I was on a plane and the doors had not closed. And we got into a discussion around a very sensitive topic. We had just completed an acquisition. And I was trying to be tender with this one executive who was not really cooperating. And I should have realized that I didn't get her trust, and I jumped all the way to the tenacity part, the toughness. And I basically said, I'm the CEO, and this is, where we're going to proceed. When the doors to the plane closed and I got off the phone, I felt terrible. Part of compassionate leadership is doing your own self-awareness and knowing when you messed up. And I messed up there. A, I should have never used my title. And B, I never should have provided that level of correction in front of the other executives. And so for 2.5, 3 hours when I was on that plane, wasted energy was devoted on that situation. I couldn't focus. I couldn't concentrate because I knew I messed up. And I knew I did it in front of 11 other executives. When that plane landed, I could have just ignored the situation and leaned on the fact that I am the CEO and therefore my words, mean more than anyone else's, which is not the case. I immediately called this executive and I apologized to her. And she responded by saying, no other CEO has ever reached out to me and apologized. And she was so accepting of it. And then she acknowledged what she had done wrong. And we had developed from that point forward a really effective relationship. So my point is to not practice it. It's going to affect your well-being. It's going to affect your relationships at home. You may have done wrong, but if you're not willing to accept where your errors are, the two words that can change the course of any dialogue, I'm sorry. Those two words can change the relationship in your family. It can change the relationship with your friends. And I am not afraid to say, I'm sorry. Now, the other person has to be willing to embrace it. And most people are, unless you're really cold and inhuman. Most people, when you say, I'm sorry, it totally provides a circuit breaker to the issue that you're trying to solve. And in that case, it did. And so I think by not practicing it, you waste more time. By practicing compassionate leadership, you create moments where the relationship really matures and where your well-being is absolutely increasing in the terms of feeling better about yourself.
And so that is a powerful intro to, we've mentioned a few times this concept of trust. And can you talk about how we build that foundation of trust and just lean into, for our listeners, the concepts you share around authenticity, honesty, and vulnerability? We talked about vulnerability early in the conversation. How do we pair that vulnerability with honesty and authenticity in order to generate trust with our colleagues?
Yeah, and first of all, I think we have to, take a step back and understand, how did we get to where we are today? Over the last 30 years, we've seen a continual trust decay, and I think that's a term that President Obama used in his book. We've seen a continual trust decay in our organizations and our institutions. Workers, have become increasingly disengaged and dissatisfied. The pandemic greatly accelerated these issues, and workers have emerged with a stronger, more clarified viewpoint about what they want out of work and life. And this is especially true in our younger generation. Today, workers want to feel respected, included, and empowered at work. They want to know that you know what is going on in their life, not just at work, but at home. A great example, a year and a half ago, I hired a young 23-year-old Gen Zer out of college to be a project manager in our foundation. And over the last few months, I have been observing that for whatever reason, her passion doesn't seem to be there. Now, I could just retreat and say, oh, she's lazy. Oh, she just doesn't care about our work. No, what I've been assessing is she wants to travel around the world. The organization doesn't allow that. Our work is primarily here in the United States. So rather than just react to something that, I thought might be going on, 3 weeks ago, I had a great conversation with her. I made it safe for her to share with me that it was okay that if after a year and a half, she has outgrown the position. We got up, gave each other a hug, and we agreed on a transition plan. The Donato of 5 years ago would have done something entirely different. I would have forced a higher pay. I would have, given her reasons why it was wrong to leave. That would have broken the trust. But by me really listening and understanding what she was going through, I gained, in fact, she went on to Instagram and she, spoke how, great of a boss she was working with. And, I wasn't looking for that, but I felt like, wow, that is what listening to understand and building the trust is all about. And it's being vulnerable because she knows so much about my vulnerability. She was willing to share her vulnerability, that it wasn't because she doesn't like the work, is that she's 23 years old and the world is before her and she wants to travel to Asia. She wants to go to Africa. And I encourage that. And that's what it means to develop the trust.
And when you think about that young colleague and you think about, we talked early in the conversation about the great resignation, the quiet reflection, or the quiet quitting, depending on how you view it. And a lot of the young people today are looking for purpose in the workplace and service in the workplace. Can you talk about what you've learned about those two areas and how we can use them as leaders compassionately?
One of the things, Chris, that I was really happy about as we were doing this book, it gave me a chance to do a postmortem of my career. And I can say honestly, the majority of times, because I did mess up a good portion of the time, but the majority of the time I was really practicing compassionate leadership. I started early on. My first real management job was in 1992 when I became general manager of Caremark's home care business. And I decided that since we were in healthcare, we should allow our employees to pursue their passionate and caring side for organizations that they cared about. And we did a survey, and there was 5 organizations that the 600 people in the company cared about. And we started to build relationships with those 5 to 6 organizations. One happened to be HIV/AIDS. The other happens to be the Crohn and Colitis Foundation. And we allowed those employees to take a day off with pay to help those organizations. And when you look at my career, I did that in every company that I was working in. Whether it was at Healthways when I, brought my organization Healthy Villages into Healthways and Tivity, or whether it was in, my Protocare days where we were focused on initiatives in the local community. You're absolutely correct. We are not segmented creatures. We don't leave our homes and put all of our social concerns on the front steps of our homes and then we leave to go off to work. No, we bring those concerns to our workplace. And so it is incumbent upon leaders to recognize that you need to put a soul into the company. This is why I have stated in my book, and I know it shocked a lot of leaders, for years we have heard culture eats strategy for lunch. No, it doesn't anymore. Trust does. If you don't get the trust, you will never develop a culture. You will never develop a strategy. And too many leaders start off with their 90-day plan around the vision, the mission, the culture. And what they really should do is develop a 90-day plan around how they can get and garner the trust and then jump into the vision, the mission, and the culture. And that is a little bit something different than the way we have been hardwired and how we lead.
And how does treating trust as a two-way street tie into that, Donato?
Well, I think, one of the things I've said in the 3 T's, that is absolutely wrong. And by the way, you can be on empathy overload. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you have taken the time to practice the first T, and that is understanding the other person and being able to hardwire a connection with what that person needs in their job and family life, and you get the trust, but then when you make the hard decision, that employee turns on you, that's not a two-way street. And that's why I say at that point, you have every right to sit down and share with the employee that they're not participating in the compassionate leadership relationship. That once you take the time to hear the stories, once you commit yourself to help that person develop and grow, and they can sense that there is a trustful relationship, then there should be no reason why you can't practice the 3rd T. And if that individual really doesn't embrace it, then quite frankly, there's a reason that you can say to yourself, this may not be worth my time and investment. And so we say that. Nothing wrong with ending a relationship. There's nothing wrong with that. The trust has to go both ways.
And so when we talk about building a compassionate culture, so most of our conversation right now, or so far, has been around our own compassion and being a compassionate leader. How do we then take that style and bring compassion to the whole culture of the organization? And how do we maintain that over time as the culture evolves?
Well, the first thing, and I thought you were going down that path, one of the questions that shocked every individual we interviewed was a question that I just threw in at the last minute. And the question was, how do you show yourself compassion? You can't be a compassionate leader if you don't show yourself compassion. If you don't take the time to refuel, you don't take the time to reflect on your day or take the time to just break away from your day-to-day task. And that question really did shock a lot of the leaders who recognized that they didn't always show themselves compassion. And so you have to be the model in the company to say, you know what, today I am going to take off. I need a day away from the company. And don't be afraid to explain why. Many times I would say to people, you know what, I've had a tough week. I'm going to work at home on Friday. I think it's better for me to have this balance. It shows, again, when you get back to vulnerability, it shows that same level of commitment to yourself that you are willing to make in the organization.
And so when we demonstrate that with ourselves, it gives permission to our team and the people that work for us to use those same practices themselves.
Exactly. I don't know if you read the article a few weeks ago. Again, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal. How many employees now are copying what executives have done for years? For years, executives during the summertime, they've taken Monday and Fridays off to go to their beach home. And what the article was saying is that that practice no longer is reserved for executives. That the younger employees are saying, hey, time out. Just because you're a CEO and you're thinking that you've earned the right to take care of yourself. That doesn't fly with us anymore. And I thought how brilliant that is, that the younger generation are saying we work just as hard. We go beyond the 8 hours a day that a CEO, normally demonstrates. So why shouldn't we be able to work, on the beach in the summertime? And so I think this recognition that compassion has to go both ways. It can't be something that you get just because you have 30 years with the company. Nobody should have a different right. And I think that's what we're all fighting for, is this compassionate equality among all people. Somebody recently asked me, well, who do you show compassion to in the workplace? And I was stunned. Everyone. You don't pick and choose who you show compassion to. You show it to everyone.
If you're picking and choosing, it really isn't compassion, is it?
No. And by the way, that's one of the things we got out of the survey, is that some of the leaders debated with us that they were showing compassion. And as we pushed further, it was very clear. It was very selective. It was very, very selective. And, that's not how you build trust in the organization.
Yeah. When we're being selective with our compassion, we're really not reflecting true compassion. As soon as it becomes selective, then you or I would probably say, well, now it seems more self-serving. You're targeting, if I behave X way with Y person, I get Z result, versus I'm going to lead with my heart regardless of who's on the other side of the conversation.
Exactly. And if you recall in the book, consistency is one of the key tenets to practicing compassion. Compassion is best when it is delivered equally without expectation, of merit. Think about it. Who deserves compassion? Everyone. And I think we saw this during, COVID-19. And through that pandemic, I think it's created a demand for compassion that, everyone now recognizes that we were in something all together. I think it's probably the first time in our generation where we can say everyone was impacted by the pandemic in some way or the other. And so when you look at that, that was a clear case that we were in this together. And just, like the pandemic, a workforce, we are in it together. When the numbers look good, we all celebrate. When the numbers don't look good, we all have to assess what we could have done better. And so compassion is something that has to be practiced with consistency, with cooperation, with commitment, and with communication.
In something you mentioned just a second ago around equality made me think about diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that you shared was that companies in the top quartile for a higher than average racial, ethnic diversity and higher than average gender diversity are 35 and 15% more likely to have higher profits relative to companies without diverse teams. And at the same time, we see that diversity and inclusion are often underutilized in the workplace. So what are 3 to 4 things that you think we as leaders should be focusing on when it comes to diversity and inclusion in our workforce?
Well, it's a great question. We could probably spend an entire podcast devoted to this concern that I have in terms of diversity. The type of diversity and inclusion I'm going to focus in on right now is the age. Right now, there are 5 generations in the workforce. The Gen Zers and the millennials represent, greater than 35-40%, and that's going to be 65-70% by the end of this decade. But as I shared with you, the average CEO in the company, the age is 59. And by the way, that's the same age for our elected officials in Washington. But let's just take that age 59. That means that they have been trained by educators who went to college in the 50s and 60s. And so just think about that for a moment. The outdated leadership principles that could very well be deployed now by our leaders who are running companies and who are running organizations. And let me take this a step further. You tend to hire in your own likeness. And what we found in our research is that the leadership teams for the average CEO tended to be individuals in their same age group, that for whatever reason, they were hiring in their likeness. And that doesn't bode well in a generation that is making up most of the commercial buying, that make up most of the, idealistic way of how a young person might want to buy and purchase goods. And so the encouragement around diversity and inclusion also has to be with the age. I shared with you that we hired this young college graduate out of school last year, and I have to tell you, it was by far the best decision that I made. And when you hire somebody that is young, it's not just to kind of check the box off that you hired somebody younger, than yourself. You have to really include them in decision making. And I think if you reached out to Catherine will tell you that, wow, she was not just a significant contributor in the areas that she went to school for. She had a seat at the table. She participated right at the highest level of my interactions with other CEOs. She was part of the decision making. And guess what? I learned a lot from her. I didn't realize, what I was missing in terms of understanding the psychological buying power or the psychological social interest that a younger person might have. And so this diversity and inclusion has to go beyond just what we all have identified as table stakes. It has to go into also age. We should have on our leadership team a wide, diverse group of men and women, individuals of color. We should have individuals that are young and old. And if you don't have an executive position for them, then create, if you will, a committee that includes them in a way that we can understand what their point of view might be in the organization.
So really look to get people across all spectrums, age, sex, people of color, diversity, looking at it at every single angle to make sure we're capturing everyone's voice.
Exactly right. And, by the way, we were taught by our parents, at least I was, be seen and not heard. Well, let me really surprise everyone. This generation is going to be seen and heard. And the more you block out their voice, the more you don't hear their stories, you will create the kind of tension, you will give in to the quiet quitting, you will give in to the great resignation. Their voices need to be heard, not just heard. We need to understand what they are saying. We need to ask questions around clarification. That's the new workforce that is emerging, and the workforce that people think we might go back to. I think that those who are believing that really are going to be disappointed, and they're going to be ultimately the ones that lose in this new abnormal that is unfolding before our very eyes.
And so one of the ways that we can make sure that we're increasing our compassion and leading in the ways that we want to is to reflect on how we're performing. And so Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. And Donato, you have a daily practice yourself of examining your highs and lows in order to improve. Can you share with our listeners, what does that daily practice mean for you? And what does it look like so they can use it in their life?
Well, I think that one of the things I have always said is that nobody cares what you do until they know why you do it. I'm a product of having lost my hearing, but I've had other tragedies in my life. I lost my brother in a car accident. My sister-in-law, who was my speech pathologist, who gets credit for the way I talk today, she died in childbirth due to a medication error. And then the unthinkable occurred on 9/11. My two friends and their 3-year-old son were staying with my partner and I at our summer home in Ogunquit. And we had all planned to go out together on 9/11 on United Flight 175. However, on Monday, September 10th, I woke up to a toothache. And it was so severe that I had to go and see my dentist. And because of that toothache and the fact that the airport was not far from where the dentist's office was, I decided that I would change my plans to go out on September 10th. That event changed my life. It reminded me how temporal our lives were. Because I changed my flight, I saved my life. And because I changed my plans, I'm alive today. But my friends who had changed their flight to go out on September 11th, because we all had planned to do that, they lost their lives. And when you have something like that happen to you, you do become more reflective. You realize that the life we live is temporal. And the best that we can do is each day try to improve what we do and what we say and how we interact with people. I want no one to believe that I am perfect, because I'm not. I labor every single day. I'm criticized by people who, quite frankly, may not agree with my principles on compassionate leadership, who may not like the fact that, we have a foundation, but I don't give in to those naysayers. The best thing you can do in self-reflection is to define who you want to be, and don't let other people define who you should be. And I always say the only person never to leave you is yourself. And if you can take the time to understand how you can self-improve, and every day I'm doing that. In fact, my partner of 30 years gets upset with me because he thinks I'm really hard on myself. That, I do take things more personal than the average person, because I have learned that if you commit to self-development, I'm a product of it. Chris, I shouldn't be here today talking to you for many reasons. That I had a severe speech impediment. I have a severe hearing loss. I should not have succeeded the way I succeeded. I technically should have lost my life if I would have kept my plans to go out on 9/11. I shouldn't be here. But I've learned that anger is not the way I want to define myself. The way I want to define myself is a person who is constantly improving and constantly trying to do better. I'll never be perfect, but we must strive for all good things up to perfection. And that does require taking the time to assess your daily activities and your daily involvement with people, and then identifying where you can improve.
And so when you think about your daily practice, what are 2 or 3 things that our listeners can do on a daily basis to foster that increased compassion in themselves and in their workforce? If there were 2 or 3 things that you said, hey, here's what I want you to focus on, what would you throw out at them?
Well, one of the things that I do is that whether I write it in my phone, on my email, or I write it down on a notepad, is I try to write down 1 or 2 things that I think I could have done better in the day. And I won't reflect on it during the day because you don't have the right amount of time. But that's what I will focus on when I go to bed at night. But I also focus on 1 or 2 things that I did well. And because it's not all about just improving. It's about reinforcing what you did well during, the day. For example, when I went to bed last night, there was an issue that happened last week, and I think I was spending too much time on it yesterday. And it was not really something that required the amount of time. And so when I went to bed last night, I basically challenged myself, how can I do better with that? Why, when somebody is poking at something that we are doing, why do I let that person, take me down a path where I overthink it? And so I woke up this morning with, what? I'm just not going to spend time on matters that, quite frankly, are not with relevancy. And so that constant improvement, does get you to a point. It's funny. In my office, I have a poster that basically reads as follows: when you're through developing, you're through. And I'm 66 years old. One could say, I judge my life today by how many summers I have left. I think I have 20 summers left. And some people would say, the heck with that. I only have 20 summers left. Why do I need to grow and expand my own, learning? You feel better when you've stretched yourself. You feel better when you have a goal in front of you and you've achieved that goal. And that's why leadership, this book is not about just business people. It's about our relationships with our friends, our relationships with our family, our relationships in our community. And so all of us can do better. I have to believe that, and I forget who said this, but if you put fences around people, you get sheep. We need to tear down the fences. And I think once we tear down the fences and we really acknowledge that we can improve, that maybe now when we have a conversation with somebody that may not have the same political viewpoint as we do, but we take the time to listen and understand why they believe the way they believe, that perhaps it can strengthen our relationship. What's happening right now is we react, and we don't take time to understand why we did that. That's part of the self-learning. Why are we reacting every time somebody might say something that we just totally don't agree with? Whatever happened to a conversation versus a versation? Self-awareness helps you to have better conversations and to move away from a versation to really having a conversation with other people.
And what are some tools and techniques people can use to have a conversation instead of a versation? And I love that concept of a versation because, Donato, this is the biggest problem, or not the biggest, but one of the biggest problems I see in society today, whether it's social media, whether it's the news, whether it's in the workforce, is just this constant division and anger between people, as if there has to be sides to every single issue. And we can't recognize that we probably agree on 98% of things, and we could just have a conversation on those 2% where we may have differences.
Well, I think, first of all, I think that this is why we have launched the compassionate leadership movement. That quite frankly, I do believe that we've gotten off course. It's taken us 20, 30 years to get here. I am not that naive to think that because we have a book, because we have the Compassionate Leadership Week, and because we have a movement, that we can expect that this is going to be corrected overnight. It's not. If you recall in the book, at the end, I talk about it takes 21% to really get this, moving in the right direction. And people have asked, why did you pick 21 and not 20? And I'll tell you why. The 1 stands for it begins with you. Move toward a growth mindset. If you have a fixed mindset and you're going to say all this stuff is rubbish, then you know what? You're not going to move forward. You have to have a growth mindset to say our children, their future, the next generation depends on our changing the way we communicate and the way we express compassion toward one another. And so the 1 out of the 21 begins with you. The 2 stands for find a partner to do this with. And if we can do this together, I am almost convinced that in the next 10 years, we will look back and we will say, in the year 2022, you are right, Chris. Every time somebody who didn't agree with us, when they spoke to us, we reacted. But here we are 10 years later, and I'm realizing that I don't have to agree with the other person. What my ownership is, I need to listen to why they believe this. I need to understand it and not just immediately jump to conclusions and say, because you're on this side, I don't want to have a friendship with you. Because you're, thinking this way, I really don't want, to participate in a future with you. And I think that we can, by understanding what we can do better, by understanding that we should get rid of the reactive, devices in us and be much more understanding that people have a point of view. And that point of view should be listened to. And by the way, you'll learn in those conversations that somebody might share with you that they're living with cancer. As a cancer survivor, this happened to me a few weeks ago. I didn't realize that the person had cancer. They've had cancer for 7 years. I've had cancer for 6 years. You'll learn that there's a common denominator that you had not uncovered. And what might separate you, which is really a small percentage, is not as powerful as what connects you. And you'll learn, wow, I didn't realize that about the other person. Oh, I didn't realize that person lost a brother in a car accident. I lost a brother in a car accident. And so I think by taking the time to really understand the other person's point of view, you will find what you have in common and not what is dividing you. We are too focused on the division part today and not what connects us.
100%. And that is a beautiful way to round it out, Donato. Thank you very much. So is there anything we didn't cover in this wide-ranging conversation that you want to add and make sure we get across to the listeners before we wrap things up?
I think, yes, in closing, is that compassion can be taught. This was one of the questions that, we asked all the leaders that we interview. And not every one of those leaders were born with compassion. I'm not sure I was born with compassion, though my family tells me that from a young age. But I think that they remember me from the age of 8 when I had lost most of my hearing. that, they probably saw me as more compassionate because something happened in my life along the way. But we concluded that, yes, compassion can be taught. Perhaps the most powerful way is by example. That's why it's so important for more and more people to adopt their leadership approach, and why this book has 41 different leaders who represent America. We didn't just interview political leaders. We didn't just interview CEOs. We interviewed a 17-year-old young lad who during the pandemic came up with an idea. His grandmother was struggling with loneliness, but she didn't know how to access social media and how to turn her iPhone on. So he taught her. And then it hit him, why not teach more seniors? And he started a not-for-profit that's teaching seniors how to use social media. And so my hope is for anyone who reads this book, you will learn how to practice compassion. And by the way, if you don't find it in the book, I hope that you'll develop it, a new tool on your own. And that's what this is all about.
And one of the important things while we're on that concept of finishing up with compassion can be taught, because that's also where we started our conversation today. One of the things that you talk about is the importance that we have to place on unlearning, and unlearning the wrong models, the wrong behaviors that we've developed over time. Can you share on that a little bit, Donato, as we wrap up?
Absolutely. Listen, I think that, who was it, Socrates, that said the unexamined life is not worth living? And we have to constantly examine our lives. Listen, we go into situations with biases. And what we learned in the book, that a lot of those biases have originated from our childhood, or it's originated from perhaps a role model that we were, modeling our life after. And so you've got to be willing to say that the way I might have done this is not the right way anymore. And that takes courage. And that's why we talk about courage as being a very important element. And I have been in business for many years. I've worked with many CEOs. I am going to tell you, the CEOs that have made it for 10, 15, 20 years are CEOs that have constantly recreated who they are. I had to recreate myself many times. It wasn't easy. It's not really fun to say you're messing up, and everything that you might have done over these, 10, 20 years perhaps was not correct. But boy, once you accept that, the people around you are very forgiving. People around you want to see you succeed, and we tend to stay true to our old ways of doing things because we think that that is winning people over. At the end of the day, doing the same thing constantly that might not be the right approach is not winning people over. It may win you over because you're comfortable with it. But just like when you go and buy a new suit or you go and buy a new car, you feel great. There's something new. It's fresh. There's nothing wrong with your admission that the old car that you might have been driving with for 10 years just doesn't cut the mustard anymore. That you have to go out and buy a new car. And that's the way we should look at our lives, is that we constantly have to filter out, just like the body gets rid of things after we eat that it doesn't want to stay in the body. We have to constantly cleanse ourselves of our own leadership beliefs.
And so where can our listeners find you, Donato, to learn more?
Absolutely. And so they can go to donato.tramuto.com for more information. They can go on Amazon and find the book. We will be launching this Compassionate Leadership Week, which kicks off on September 11th. And there will be a lot of information that will be available on how one can join the movement. We are planning, an annual leadership training course that people can access through our, website.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll have all that in our show notes. And thank you for joining me on The Pursuit of Learning today. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on The Pursuit of Learning. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and head over to our website, thepursuitoflearning.com, where you will find our show notes, transcripts, and more. If you like what you see, sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, your host in learning, Clint Murphy.